Wow. Joining us now, member of the House Intelligence Committee, Democratic Congressman Jim Himes of Connecticut. In about 90 minutes, the committee is expected to meet behind closed doors with the intelligence community's Inspector General about that whistleblower complaint.
Jim, would you like to talk about that or Justin Trudeau?
No.
Yeah, Joe, I'm really glad I'm not getting pulled in on Justin Trudeau. Thank you for that.
Yeah, good. Okay. See, that's a no on Justin Trudeau. So what are you hoping to find out today in the hearing, and are there any questions that you won't be able to get the answers you need?
Well, Mika, there's really two categories of things that we need to know. Number one, obviously, we need to know the substance of what this whistleblower complaint is. As you know, there's reporting in the Washington Post that this may involve the president making a promise to a foreign leader, maybe on a phone call. This is not something I know about from my job here. It's what I read in the newspaper. Never a comfortable moment for a member of Congress. So we obviously need to know what happened there to make sure that, well, who knows? The second thing, of course, we need to reestablish, and this is part of a larger theme, is that the DNI, the acting DNI, broke the law when he decided to basically intercept the Inspector General's report to Congress. Never been done before in the history of Inspector General reports to the Congress, and of course it is an illegal act. There is nothing in the statute that gives the Director of National Intelligence the authority to do what he did, and the American people should be worried about that because, you know, when you're talking about a classified environment, when you're talking about NSA and CIA, you either go the established route to talk about something that you think is a violation of the law, that is to say you come to Congress the way this whistleblower does, or maybe you do what Edward Snowden did and just take all of our secrets and put them out there. You know, the American people should think hard about which route they prefer, and of course the DNI has compromised the legal route.
So, Willie, obviously, just a side note here, we've been talking about Benny Gantz and Benjamin Netanyahu. A very close race. The Washington Post just broke the headline that Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his main rival hinted a possible power-sharing agreement to end political crisis, and that's all they say. Say it's a developing story, they'll continue.
Which would be a concession for Netanyahu to even access that he could give some power away. We'll stay on top of that story, but Congressman, I want to go back to this this IG report, this person who's going to come to you, sit before Congress today, before your committee anyway, and offer you classified information about who the president talked to and what the promise was. What would be the next step from your committee based on what you learn in about 90 minutes from now? Depending on what it is, there's been some speculation. Again, we should underline we don't know who he spoke to or what the promise was. Speculation that it may have been a July 31st phone call to Vladimir Putin that was originally characterized by the White House as to talk about Siberian wildfires, which raised some eyebrows at the time. What would you do next? What will you do next with the information you hear this morning?
Well, and let's reiterate that we're talking about press reports here. We don't know what exactly is in the substance of this complaint. But look, it could be anything, including nothing. You know, not all whistleblower complaints are about serious stuff. The point is, of course, it's up to Congress to decide that because the law says that these complaints will be transmitted to the appropriate committees in the Congress. But it could be nothing. It could be something very, very serious. You know, I almost hate to speculate, but if the president made some kind of promise to Vladimir Putin, and here we need to be very careful too. He is the president of the United States. He has the authority to declassify whatever materials he wants. He has the authority to negotiate with foreign leaders. But, you know, just to sort of play the other end of the spectrum, if he promised Vladimir Putin, you know, to lift sanctions if the Russians help him in the next election, now we have a very, very serious challenge to our democracy. And I'm not saying it's that. I'm just saying could be nothing, could be very serious. Can't speculate until we hear from the Inspector General.
Well, I'd only say if the Inspector General said it is of, quote, urgent concern. Right. I don't think
it's not nothing.
It's not just any whistleblower.
Not nothing.
Yeah, the problem with this president, of course, is that, you know, the president via Twitter threatens to incinerate North Korea with nuclear weapons. You know, I mean, is that serious or not? Yeah, so we're going to have some thinking to do.
Right. That's a good point. Congressman David Ignatius has a question for you. David?
Congressman, I just want to ask you about your own sense of the role going forward of the acting Director of National Intelligence, Joseph McGuire. This is not somebody people know a lot about. What are some of the questions that you've got for McGuire and his role?
Well, this gets us to the process that he followed, because he violated a very clear and explicit law about how he transmits whistleblower complaints to the Congress. So there's no ambiguity in the law. The law basically, once the Inspector General has determined that a whistleblower complaint is serious, the DNI has basically a clerical role. He sends it to Congress. He doesn't consult with the DOJ. He sure does not consult with the White House. And the reason that's important, we got to understand why this is important. The DNI is the boss. He's the main man in the intelligence community. So if you're a guy beavering away in the intelligence community and you see something that concerns you, and remember, the intelligence community takes lethal action, it surveils people, it does very dangerous stuff. If you're some guy beavering away at NSA and you see something that you think is illegal, if you think that I take the legal route and my boss is going to decide whether Congress gets to see what I'm worried about, that whole channel does not work. And we have a profound inability to provide oversight to the intelligence community.
So Congressman, the question is, what are the consequences for Acting Director McGuire for suppressing this information? Just straight up, what's your judgment about that?
Well, he needs to be held accountable the way anybody else who breaks the law is held accountable. And this points to a much larger issue, what we can just spend 10 seconds on. Corey Lewandowski comes to the Congress and says, I don't feel like answering your questions. No assertion of any legitimate privilege. The DNI is now making up privileges that don't exist in the law. You know, Congress is going to need to rebuild the sense that you don't get to hold it in contempt, that when Congress says you come and give us answers, you do it. The Trump administration has basically said we don't recognize this, and that's not the way this country works. And look, my Republican friends who are hiding in the cracks in the floorboards here in the Capitol, they ought to remember that there will be a Democratic president someday. And they should ask themselves how they feel about that Democratic president, you know, flipping them the bird every time they want to do oversight of the activities of the executive when it is run by a Democrat.
Congressman, it's Jonathan Lemire. Switching gears slightly to the situation with Iran. Yesterday, Secretary of State Pompeo was in the Middle East and declared that the attack on the oil field was a, quote, act of war. The president sort of backed off that a little bit and said he wanted to slow things down, wanted to consider weighing his options before deciding what to do next. My question to you is, how concerning is it for you that the administration is talking out of both sides of his mouth, that there's such conflicting messages from Washington to both our allies and our potential adversaries?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I actually asked this in a meeting with the intelligence community the other day. You know, Saudi Arabia isn't even pointing the finger at Iran. Look, I believe that Iran was involved in this. You know, the Houthis don't have the technical capability to pull off that kind of risk. We don't know 100% for sure yet, so we have to be careful about that. Look, you know, Pompeo's not wrong. When missiles attack one of your oil installations, that is pretty clearly an act of war. What's a more interesting question is, what do the Saudis do about it? Now, you guys concerned me a little bit previously in that segment. It was Saudi Arabia that was attacked. We've sold Saudi Arabia hundreds of billions of dollars worth of advanced weaponry. You know, I think everybody, if it turns out to be Iran, would forgive them for doing a proportionate response for an act of war on their territory. The United States is not obligated to do that. We are not the world's policeman. We are certainly not a treaty ally of a country that dismembers journalists, that bombs school children in Yemen, that won't let women out of the house without a male relative. I want to slow down this notion that you guys were pushing, that somehow our credibility, Iran needs to be checked, it needs to be pushed back on, but it is not necessarily the United States' role to retaliate for a strike that they may have done in Saudi Arabia.
Elise?
Congressman, some diplomats in the region argue that when Iraq invaded Kuwait, it was not Kuwait that went to war with Iraq. It was the United States that built a coalition and kind of stood up the international community. What do you think of that argument?
Well, I think that is, when you go to war, that is absolutely the way you do it. But I also think that if we go to war, the Constitution is very clear that this institution that I'm standing in right now decides to do that, not the President of the United States. So, yes, that is the way to go to war. But, Mika, we need to remember two things that happened after the Kuwait War, which was exactly the way one does these things. You know, God bless George H.W. Bush. Number one, it was a coalition. Number two, we need to remember that the President has created the conditions that led to this attack. If we were still in the Iran nuclear agreement, which the president, a man who couldn't tell you the difference between uranium and plutonium, decided was a bad idea, that he scotched, that he destroyed, there never would have been an attack on Saudi Arabia. Would the Iranians be behaving themselves? No, they wouldn't. But what they're doing in Saudi Arabia, what they're doing with these tankers, all of the misbehavior they're doing because we walked away from an agreement that we didn't need to walk away from. So we also need to remember that we are where we are because of the actions of Donald Trump.
All right, Congressman Jim Himes, thank you very much for being on the show this morning. We'll be following 9 a.m. To see what happens with the Intelligence Committee. Still ahead, Silicon Valley and the Democratic Party used to be allies. These days, not so much. New York Magazine is taking a look at that breakup and what it means as we head toward 2020. That reporting is ahead. And as we go to break, a look at the latest issue of Time Magazine. The new cover story is about how the e-cigarette maker Juul hooked kids and ignited a public health crisis. Morning Joe is back in a moment.
Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.